Heidelberg's nights were colder than I had expected. The damp air seeped through the broken windows of the abandoned school, carrying the scent of mold and decay. This building had been empty for half a century, its brick walls crumbling, its doors and windows shattered, as if time had gnawed away at its body. I stood at the entrance, gripping my notebook and camera, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. A narrow hallway stretched before me, blanketed in fallen leaves. The wind moaned through the cracks, a sharp, hollow sound. Like a whisper. Like a sighing breath against my ear. I stepped forward, each footfall met with a slow, agonized creak of wooden boards. Like I was walking over brittle bones. At the end of the hallway, I stopped before a classroom door. Its plaque was missing, leaving only empty screw holes in the frame. The door hung slightly ajar, gaping like a half-open mouth. Waiting. I hesitated, then pushed. The rusty hinges let out a long, aching groan, the sound spilling into the silence. I lifted my flashlight, and my breath caught in my throat. The classroom was full. Row upon row of wooden desks. And behind them, sitting perfectly still, were figures. Not students. Mannequins. Or puppets, maybe. They were dressed in old school uniforms, faded and moth-eaten, their wooden hands resting neatly on their desks. Their heads tilted slightly forward. Their faces, each one carved into a permanent smile. Glassy, lifeless eyes stared at the chalkboard, as if waiting for a teacher to arrive. My pulse quickened. I took a slow step back, my mind racing for an explanation. Some forgotten art project? An elaborate prank? But the precision of their placement, the eerily natural posture. It felt wrong. Like they had been waiting for something. For someone. For me. The air in the classroom was thick and unmoving, as if holding its breath. Without thinking, I reached out. My fingers brushed against the cold wooden shoulder of one of the mannequins. A simple touch. And then, a voice. Soft. Right beside my ear. A whisper. "Teacher, can we go home now?" My heart slammed against my ribs. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. The door swung shut behind me. A loud, final thud. I turned, the classroom was silent. Nothing had moved. But I could feel it. Something was watching me. Something that had been waiting in the shadows of these rotting walls. Waiting for me to come back. I needed an explanation. Something, anything, that would let me rationalize what I had seen. The next morning, I buried myself in city archives, combing through yellowed newspapers in a dusty records room. Then I found it. A headline, stark and unfeeling. Entire class perishes in fire, only one survivor. The article detailed a sudden, devastating fire. The flames had started in that very classroom. By the time firefighters arrived, the entire school had been consumed, the exits inexplicably locked from the inside. No one escaped. Not the students. Not the teacher. All of them were trapped, their final moments swallowed by smoke and fire. Except one girl survived. Ava Lindemann. A small black and white photograph accompanied the article. She stood alone amid the ruins of the school, staring into the camera. But her expression, no tears, no fear, just a hollow, unsettling gaze, like she had seen something beyond death. Like she understood something far worse. The article went on to say that Ava had been hospitalized for a short time after the fire. Then, she vanished, gone without a trace. Her name became just another lost record, erased by time. I sat frozen, staring at her photo. Something about her posture, her eyes. I had seen her before. Not in person, but somewhere deep in my memory, lurking in the corners of my mind. I kept digging. Then I found it. A class photo, taken a year before the fire. The children were lined up neatly, their smiles innocent, unaware of what was to come. But Ava? She stood at the far edge, not smiling, not looking at the camera. She was staring beyond it. At something else. At something no one else could see. A cold dread curled around my ribs. I had to go back. I had to see for myself. Night fell. With my flashlight and camera in hand, I retraced my steps through the silent corridors. The air felt heavier than before, as if the school itself was waiting for me. I pushed open the classroom door. The wooden mannequins were still there. Still seated. Still smiling. But something was wrong. They had moved. Slightly. Just enough that their heads were now angled toward me. My breath hitched. Cold sweat pricked my skin. I forced myself inside. Then, my flashlight swept across the room, and my stomach twisted violently. Because there, amid the mannequins, sat a real person. She wore the same old school uniform. Her hands rested motionless on the desk. Her head tilted downward, long black hair curtaining her face. Like she had never left. Like she had always been there. The air thickened, suffocating. I couldn't move. Then, she looked up. Her eyes met mine. Dark. Hollow. Endless. And then she smiled. A small, almost imperceptible curl of her lips. Something stirred around me. And I realized. The mannequins were moving. Their glass eyes were shifting. Their wooden mouths were beginning to smile wider. They were looking at me. I broke free from my paralysis, spun around, and bolted for the door. The moment I crossed the threshold, it slammed shut behind me, hard enough to shake the walls. I didn't stop running. Not through the hallways. Not through the courtyard. Not even as I burst out onto the empty streets, the cold night air slicing against my skin. Under the dim street lights, I finally stopped, panting, my hands shaking. Then, I looked down at my arm, and my blood turned to ice. Because there, burned into my skin, was a blackened handprint. I did not sleep that night. The charred handprint remained on my skin, an imprint that refused to fade, no matter how hard I scrubbed. It wasn't just a stain. It was a mark. A grip that refused to let go. By dawn, despite every rational instinct telling me to leave, to call the police, to forget this place, I found myself standing once again at the gates of the abandoned school. Because I knew. If I didn't face this, if I didn't understand, I would never be free. The school was silent, as if it had never welcomed the living. The hallway stretched longer than before, its air thick with something unseen. The dust-covered floor was disturbed. A trail of footprints, small, delicate, not mine. They led straight to the classroom. To her. The door was unlocked. It opened with a slow, reluctant groan, the hinges shrieking against the weight of time. A faint burnt smell filled the air. Like embers buried beneath cold ash, refusing to be extinguished. The mannequins were still at their desks. But now, their heads were tilted slightly, as if they had shifted. As if they had been watching the door, waiting. And there, at the center of it all, she was still sitting there. Her hands lay lightly on the desk, her head bowed, dark hair cascading over her face. At first, she looked asleep. But something was different. She looked more solid than before, her skin pale, delicate, almost waxen, like something preserved for far too long. And then I saw it. Her clothes were burned. The edges of her uniform were still blackened, crisp, as if the fire had never truly died. as if she had been frozen in the moment of burning, trapped between past and present. The air shifted. The temperature rose. And then, a soft click echoed through the room. Her head lifted. I froze. Her face was partially destroyed, melted away by flames that still lived somewhere in time. The edges of her lips moved, whispering something too faint to hear. I wanted to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. I looked down and saw a hand, small, charred, clutching my ankle. I couldn't breathe. The mannequins began to move. Their glass eyes shifted, their smiles stretched wider, unnatural. Not static carvings, but something else. Something alive. The walls started to blacken, peeling away in long, burnt strips, as if the fire had never left. As if it was waking up. Smoke curled through the cracks, filling the air with the bitter sting of burning wood, burning cloth, burning flesh. And she stood up. Her arms hung limp at her sides, her head slightly bowed. But she was coming toward me. With each step, a blackened footprint appeared beneath her. A burnt shadow of herself, leading her forward. Her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, held something beyond rage, beyond sorrow. A question. A plea. A memory that refused to die. And I was being pulled into her nightmare. The fire took everything. My consciousness twisted in the heat, torn between reality and nightmare. I knew I was still inside the classroom. But the world had changed. The abandoned desks, the wooden mannequins. They were gone. All I could see was fire. Flames roared, devouring the wooden walls, choking the air with thick, black smoke. The stench of burning flesh was suffocating. The desks, no longer empty. They were covered in ash and charred remains. And the mannequins, they were no longer mannequins. They had become corpses. Bodies hunched over their desks, their faces blackened and peeling, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. The door was gone. The windows, just a void of endless blackness. No escape. And then the screaming started. Dozens of voices, high and shrill, filled with agony. The wails of children, their cries twisting, echoing through the firestorm. I tried to move, to run, but I couldn't. Something held me in place. A grip like molten iron, dragging me deeper into the inferno. I fought, struggled, but my limbs refused to move. I looked down and saw my own skin peeling away, cracking, burning, revealing charred flesh beneath. I was becoming one of them. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. A voice screamed inside my head, raw with desperation. I thrashed, my consciousness shattering apart, and the world around me collapsed. I gasped. The air was cold. Night surrounded me. I was no longer in the burning classroom. I was outside the school. My body shook violently, sweat soaking through my clothes. My lungs ached as if I had truly inhaled smoke and ash. But the scars remained. I slowly looked down at my arm. The blackened imprint was still there. Proof that I had not imagined any of it. And then, something slid from my notebook. A single, yellowed photograph. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The image showed a classroom. That classroom. The burned children, their uniforms intact, their faces young and smiling. Except, at the center of the photo, standing among them, was a new figure. A blurred, almost familiar silhouette. I stopped breathing. It was me. A sickening wave of nausea twisted my gut. The cold seeped into my bones, crawling up my spine. Slowly, I lifted my head, and my eyes fell upon the school. It stood silent, lifeless. But at the end of the hallway, beyond the shattered windows, the classroom door was open. A crack, just enough to see the darkness inside. And within that blackness, a pair of eyes stared back at me.